Welcome to the March 2025 edition of the Agricultural Market Situation Outlook webinar. This almost marks the fifth anniversary of the kickoff of this series, which began in late March after COVID hit. It's been an interesting ride. It's been a good series. It's kind of got a unique start. My name is Dave Ripplinger, Extension Economic Specialist with NDSU Extension, and the regular host of the webinar. The Agricultural Market Situation and Outlook webinar is a regular program of NDSU Extension. We target farmers, ranchers, agribusiness leaders, and others who want to know more about the current and expected market conditions and their impact on North Dakota's economy. Today's webinar is being recorded. Will be archived on the NDSU Extension YouTube channel and the webpage for this series. Today we have presentations from Brian Parman, Frayne Olson, Tim Petrie, and myself. Just so you know, you'll be muted during the webinar. You are encouraged to submit questions. Strongly encouraged. You can use either the Q&A feature or the chat function, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation, at the end of the period. If you have any technical questions, feel free to reach out to me using chat or email. But with that, I'll turn it over to Brian Parman.
And marking the 5-year anniversary, I think I've gone first every single time. Pretty sure. Just worked out that way. Natural leaders. So today I got two topics, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time, no more than 2 or 3 hours on either topic, so don't worry about that. But the first topic I'm going to cover is just the quick notes on interest rates and inflation real quick in light of the Fed having a meeting here in a week or so. And the February inflation numbers came out not long ago. They said, according to reports, inflation had grown at a little bit slower pace than they thought it was. Not a lot. We're talking about tenths of a point. So the expectation was headline inflation was going to be 2.9. It was 2.8, and core was going to be about 3.2, and it turned out to be 3.1. So it wasn't a massive reduction in the rate of inflation over what the industry expected, but it was a reduction nonetheless. But one thing I wanted to cover during this webinar here real quick as it relates to inflation is, I think we're all pretty aware now, or at least if you've heard me talk on this, how they monitor the unemployment rate, and as determining, are things slowing down, is the economy headed toward recession, and do interest rates need to be adjusted? And so this is the latest and greatest on the unemployment rate. And the big spike there you see on the left, that's as we came out of the pandemic lockdowns, and by around mid-July, the unemployment rate of 2021, I should say, the unemployment rate had fallen below 5%, and it's pretty much remained there between the high threes and the low fours now for the better part of 4 years. And that's roughly about where it was prior to the pandemic hitting, right around the percentages that it is now. And this is all despite the fact that the Fed raised rates from 0 to 0.25% all the way up to 5.5%. They've since reduced it a 1 percentage point. But you can see, based on unemployment, the U.S. economy has pretty much absorbed that pretty well. And when I'm talking about unemployment, one of the things that folks always bring up are things like the labor force participation rate. And so I thought I'd throw a chart on there to show you. And the reason I start this graph in the year 1998 or 2000 or so, that was the height of the labor force participation rate. That's the highest it's ever been in the U.S., where just over 67% of all adults age 16 and over were working. Okay, so 67%. Since the peak around that 2000 frame, it's been a steady march downwards. And before this, the last time it was as low as it is today was back in the 40s and 50s, before women entered the workforce, and in which case it was closer to the 50% mark. And you see it stabilized there from 2012 to 2020. Then we had the pandemic lockdowns, labor force participation rate went down, and it's rebounded, but still about just over 62 or just under 63%. Considerably lower when you think about the millions of people than it was during the peak. And based on a lot of the data that they're showing, it's never going to recover, and here's why. Okay, so this shows the ratio, and this graph is from the Congressional Budget Office Demographic Outlook back published in November of 24, so fairly recent, at least by government report standards. And the ratio of people aged 25 to 64, so that's considered prime working age, 25 to 64 years old. I know the labor force said 16, but you consider at 25 to years old, you've either possibly graduated from college or likely have if you were going to go, or if you didn't go, you've gotten the skills and you've developed some work experience. And so your most productive years are 25 to about 64, 65 years old. And if you go back to the 1950s, okay, I know that was a long time ago, but this ratio was about six. So in other words, there were six people in prime working age for every one person over the age of 65. Okay. You come to about today here, 2025, it's looking 2.8. So less than half. So we have less than half as many people compared to, it's not that we have half as many. I mean, if you looked in total numbers, but relative to the number of people over 65 years old, we've got half as many people as we did 70 years ago or so in prime working age. And then that projection, because of demographics, is going to decline even further and be down to almost 2 to 1 by 2055. So, in other words, for every retired person or of retirement age, as we say, uh, you've got two people in prime working age. So we go from, in about 100 years, we go from 6 to 1 to 2 to 1. All right, so that's a big shift in the number of people of prime working age are available and not retired and in the workforce. Okay, so what are you going to do with newly created jobs and everything else? And that same report looked at this population growth and contributing factors, and the same projection from the same report saying that by that 2055 population growth is expected to be basically zero. Births minus deaths are pretty much going to be offset only by net immigration. In fact, if you didn't have net immigration, um, and you look at the number here, we would actually have a population decline, which brings about an interesting scenario. Like, how do you have GDP growth with population decline, right? Because one of the things that happens is newly created jobs are then taken on by increasing numbers of people in the workforce. So the only way to really have GDP growth is by the current work. That's if things stay at zero, current workers being more productive. All right. And then the flip side to that is, what do you do with consumer demand if you're not increasing the population numbers? People either have to consume more or they wind up cannibalizing, with the number of people age 65 and older, that percentage growing, it cannibalizes the targeting of the younger demographic, items that they might um, typically buy, youth sports equipment or something like that. That goes down and then other things go up. And it's really unprecedented, and I want to show this because it will literally be the first time in the nation's history that we've had either no or potentially negative population growth. And this is just an old chart showing, but since the birth of the US, and it's not a very old country by world standards, but nonetheless, we have never had a period of flat or even declining population growth. So while a lot of folks always think that the situation they're in is unprecedented, and then I can go and point to some period in history where it was either more, I don't know, significant or whatever, and this truly is the first time that we're facing this challenge. Now, other countries have faced it. Japan, for instance, many of the old Soviet affiliated European countries, what we used to call the Eastern Bloc, have experienced net population declines, but it's the first time in the US. And how we're going to handle that going forward. And I bring all that back to say that one of the things that rising interest rates has typically done is increased unemployment. But we may be in a scenario right now with these demographic changes going on that steps that they would take to increased unemployment in the past might not actually do that because we're losing people in the workforce. And all that is to say, the meeting with the Fed this week, it's the market's, or not this week, but in the next week or so, the market's basically thinking the Fed's not going to change rates at all. Now, if you've heard me talk about this, I don't put a ton of stock in these market surveys on or bets on what they think the Fed is going to do, unless we're really close to the meeting point. Once we get within a week or a few days of the actual Fed meeting, the market tends to actually hit it. And so the vast majority are thinking no change in the Federal Reserve policy as it pertains to interest rates. Now, with tariffs, which we'll be talking about just at the bitter end here, the things could change dramatically. That's the big unknown right now. It's a lot easier to predict status quo, and even then, we miss the mark quite often. Second thing is that I want to talk about, and I put this in our Ag by the Numbers newsletter that we just sent out yesterday. This is USDA's projections for net farm and net cash income for 2025, and I was a bit surprised to see that USDA was projecting an increase of 41 billion in 2025 compared to 2024. Okay, so you can get this report if you want to read some more of the details in it, or USDA's report that is from their site, and the citations here at the bottom of the chart. But you see it, 2023, net cash farm income, net farm income declines a little bit in 2024, and then this big increase in 2025. Okay, so you're thinking, well, based on where commodity prices are projected to be, and Frane's going to talk more about that, uh, and yields last year weren't awful by any stretch of the imagination. So where is this big increase coming from? Well, if you look at cash receipts from the same report for the major crops, especially the ones grown in North Dakota, well, corn's expected to be, 2.5 billion or so lower this year. Soybeans, around $3 billion lower in cash receipts this year compared to 2024. So that's, it's probably not coming from there. Fruits and nuts, not that it matters to us, but it does nationally, about the same. A little bit of an increase in like vegetable crops and melons, but 1.3 billion or so. Wheat off about, you know, $300 million. And then cotton up a little bit, but that certainly doesn't explain $41 billion. Cattle and calves is actually expected net income wise to be down slightly this year, but that's not necessarily because of prices. That's also volumes going there. So Tim will talk about prices, but volume of sales might be down a little in that case. Dairy up a bit, broiler chickens up a good bit, hogs up 1.5 billion or so, and then a slight decline in eggs, not because of prices, but because of volume sold. That certainly, again, doesn't explain $41 billion in increases. And so you might think, well, it's on the production cost side, right? Well, not exactly. Labor costs expected to be up in ag. Livestock poultry purchases more expensive. Seed up slightly. Property taxes and fees up a little bit. Net rents up a bit. Feed costs down slightly, but certainly not to the tune of $40 billion explanation. Interest about the same. Fertilizer down a little bit from the previous year. Pesticides and fuel oil, negligible decreases. So where's it all coming from? Well, this is the direct government payments projection by USDA back in February, and this was 2024, and then this is 2025. Okay, and then when you look at this chart, CRP, WRP, that would be kind of this, uh, I guess, kind of light olive color, and then the bar right above it, that would be like ARC and PLC. Okay, so that's payments that are a function of crop prices, so that would go into that. And then this big gray bar on top is all other payments. Okay, so that's going to be your ad hoc disaster assistance type payments. Um, they probably could have lumped it in. If you look back to 2020, they called it something else. They called it pandemic assistance and non-USDA pandemic assistance. Back in 2020, this would have been the CFAP payments, the red on the top, and then the orange would have been things like PPP. And then in 2021, you had some residual of those payments carrying over into 21. So you still had some red CFAP and some orange PPP, and you still had a little bit of holdover from market facilitation. Those all gone by 2022. But we had disaster payments in 22, 23, 24, and then this big increase. And so that's the part of that American Relief Act and what was discussed or passed back in December for some of those payments, and that's where the bulk of this is coming from. Now, in our Ag by the Numbers newsletter, I kind of break down and say, okay, what would 2025 look like if the ad hoc disaster payments were similar to what you would see in 2025 as 2024, and then with these ARC PLC as well as CRP and WRP and other conservation payments lumped in, and it is a lot different than this. And what you would see is basically net farm incomes and net cash incomes very similar to the previous year. I mean, that's essentially what that would project out to be. And again, in our newsletter, I go into more detail on what those numbers actually are. But the bottom line is, based on what they were showing here for net farm incomes and government payments, that's where the real increase in cash income and net farm income are coming from. And I say all that with the disclaimer that we still have the potential tariffs coming about on April 2nd. I know we had some tariffs that were at least said to be going to be implemented if some considerations and basically compromises not made by Mexico and Canada a week or so ago, and those were put on hold. So this has one big, all of these projections have that big tariff caveat put on them as well. And that doesn't mean there won't be, if there are tariffs and it severely impacts agriculture, which it likely will, that there wouldn't be other assistance added onto it. Again, I don't speculate on what they may or may not pass politically, but that's what the situation looks like right now. That were it not for these ad hoc and disaster payments coming in, we would probably be expecting a net farm income comparable to 2024 plus or minus. And that's where it sits, and that's all we know. And we've, Frain's answered questions about tariffs. Dave, Tim, John, myself, all of us, Ron, and a lot of that we just don't know right now. But this is the best guess we have as of the information that we've got available to us and as things sit. So if you have any questions about this, you can feel free to email me, or I'll be on at the end of the webinar here to answer any questions like we always are. But like I said, I guess the takeaway is probably status quo on interest rates in this next meeting coming up. And the increase in net farm incomes, it is a sizable increase, but the vast majority of it coming from the increase that is coming from direct increases in ad hoc direct government payments. So with that, I believe Dr. Frain Olson is next. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. This was kind of a Paul Harvey version of our situation and outlook with the rest of the story on the demographics side. But
good afternoon, everybody. Frain Olson, crop economist, marketing specialist with NDSU Extension. Glad we could visit today in person. My travel schedule is beginning to slow down a bit, but it's still going to be pretty hectic here for about another month or so. We're going to talk a little bit about the March USDA report, but I'm also going to talk, just like Brian, specifically about some of the things going on in the world of tariffs, because I get a lot of questions about those. If you do have any questions or any issues that you want to talk about offline or privately, that's fine. Here's my contact information, email. My cell phone number is probably a little more reliable than my work number, just because of my travel schedule. Again, I encourage everybody to try and type in any questions you have in the Q&A function. So let's dive in here, get my screen to work. So just at a very high level, the WASDE report, the World Agricultural Supply Demand Estimates, were relatively neutral for corn, soybeans, and wheat. I'll go through those numbers in just a little bit, but it'll only take a few minutes. It was very basic changes. Nobody was expecting any big adjustments. We didn't get any. Quick update on Brazil and Argentina. The weather conditions have been more favorable. Harvest progress, especially in Brazil, is going smoothly. It started out a little bit slow because of some rains in Mato Grosso, but things have really improved since then. The areas of Argentina that have been exceptionally dry have been getting some rain, so it looks like things are moving pretty well. There's no big weather story coming out of South America. The one that has been dominating the news and all of my time over the last several weeks has been this trade and tariff issues. It's definitely adding some higher volatility, a lot of uncertainty into the grain markets. I'll talk about those more specifically in just a minute. So just to give you the formal presentation on the estimates coming out of USDA. So as before, the blue line on top is the average trade estimate. These are the numbers that the private forecasters and analysts had put together. This is what they were expecting to see on average. The highlighted black line towards the bottom is, oops, I forgot to change the dates. I am sorry. I forgot to change the dates. That should be the February 11th and March 11th. I will make those corrections here in a moment. So the black line, heavy black line is the February 11th. The red line is the March 11th data that we got just a couple days ago. So if you notice and look at the bottom lines, the soybean number is identical to what we had last month. The corn number is identical to what we had the last month. There was a small adjustment in the wheat numbers. The wheat inventory went up just a little bit. It was a combination of a slight reduction in exports, the forecast for U.S. wheat exports, and there was just a tiny increase in the amount of wheat imports. We don't import a lot of wheat, but that forecasted number did go up a little bit. And the same thing, I forgot to change the date on this slide. I apologize. But these are the crop report estimates coming out of South America. Just what is the size of the Argentine and Brazilian corn and soybean crop? Again, essentially no changes. USDA did not change their numbers at all when you compare the black line, which should be the February 11th, and the red line, which should be the March 11th. Those are identical numbers. There was no adjustments. And if you look at the blue line on top, what the private analysts were expecting, they really weren't expecting any changes either. So very benign report. I would call it neutral for both of those. Basically, all of the other information, and I'll call it noise in the marketplace, overshadowed what we got from USDA early this week. So let's dive into this tariffs. And I thought I would spend just a couple minutes. There's a lot of confusion about what has happened, what hasn't happened, what is in place, what is not in place. So I want to go through a very brief timeline and give you just a high-level overview of what is currently going on with this tariffs and trade issues. Okay, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I will focus a bit on potential implications for the U.S. grain markets. Okay, so February 1, the U.S. Added a 10% tariff onto all products imported from China. That was in February. China did retaliate. They responded to that by adding 15% onto U.S. coal, liquefied natural gas, that's LNG, and 10% on U.S. crude oil, large engine automobiles, and certain agricultural equipment. Now, I did look at that. Agricultural equipment was primarily food processing equipment. So this is what China retaliated for U.S. products that they purchase. Now, on March 4th, about 9 days ago, there was another update. The U.S. added 20% tariff on all products imported from China. Now, I want to be really careful here. This was really 10% on top of 10%. So the 10% number in February 1 was moved to a 20% number on March 4th. So there now is a 20% tariff on all products the U.S. purchases from China. Now, China's retaliation on this second round, for ag products specifically now, they added 15% tariff on U.S. wheat, U.S. corn, cotton, and chicken products. And they added an additional 10% on U.S. soybean, sorghum, pork, beef, fruits, vegetables, and some aquatic products. Okay, so the big ones that we obviously are concerned about, wheat, corn, soybeans, pork, beef, those are all really important to the grains that we grow and the grains that we export from this region. So yes, they did retaliate, not like they did last time, not quite as aggressively, but there's definitely a response. Also on March 4th, not only was there an increase in the Chinese import tariffs, but the one that caught a lot of the news and attention was the U.S. added a 25% tariff on all products imported from Mexico and Canada. Now, when that first announcement came out, there was some negotiations that went on, and shortly after the initial announcement, there was an amendment, a revision. Okay, and that revision was that those 25% tariffs would not apply, I want to emphasize, would not apply to products covered under the USMCA or the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is the renegotiated NAFTA. So there are still some products that have that 25% tariff, but most of the agricultural products that we think about, in particular the grains, like corn and soybeans and wheat, that move between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, are not being tariffed at this time. So that's part of this exclusion piece. Okay. However, there were a couple things that were not covered, but instead of 25%, the tariff was reduced to 10%. And one of those was energy products. So energy products are not included, particularly crude oil, not included in USMCA, but rather than 25% tariff, the crude oil will be at 10% tariff. Now, more important for you guys listening today, that also includes potash. So there is an extra 10% tariff on potash coming from Canada into the US because potash was not part of that USMCA agreement. Okay, so it's not a 25% tariff on potash, thank goodness, but it is an additional 10% tariff. So now the fertilizer in the bins right now in storage, ready to go when spring's work hits, that does not have this tariff applied. It will be for any new potash coming across the border when these tariffs are in place. Now, one final piece on the things that just happened between the US, Canada, and Mexico is that USMCA agreement exemptions, the things I just talked about, the exemptions only apply until April 2. So on April 2nd, I want you to circle that on your calendar with a great big red marker, because on April 2, there's going to be a whole bunch of things that start to change. Now, I know, again, there's a lot of politics playing right now. There's a lot of discussions going on. You're hearing a lot of rumors within the marketplace, what's going to happen, and that will continue up into and probably through April 2nd. So please, that is going to be a critical date. Now, more recently, yesterday, one more round, okay, the U.S. added a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. Now, our biggest international supplier for steel and aluminum is Canada. So Canada, a little bit from Mexico, we get some from Europe, we do get some from China. Okay, now that 25% tariff is on all steel and aluminum. And as of today, actually as of mid 12:01 this morning, Canada did retaliate with 25% tariffs on US metals, computers, sports equipment, and cast iron products and some tools. So it really didn't directly apply to agricultural products, thank goodness, but there are retaliatory tariffs on several of the US products. Okay, in addition, as of this morning, the European Union announced that they were also going to provide retaliatory tariffs on about $28 billion of US goods. Now, I have not been able to track down a specific list for the EU and exactly what products were included, but it does include the press reports coming out of both Europe as the United States do comment directly that beef, poultry, bourbon, motorcycles, peanut butter, and jeans are the most commonly cited products. Now, the list is much longer than that, but those are the ones that are being highlighted within the news. Okay, so we're starting to see these U.S. Import tariffs be put on. There's retaliation by some of our trading partners. Exactly how they're going to retaliate, on what specific products they're going to retaliate, is still a little bit fuzzy and unknown, but this thing is starting to escalate. Okay, now let's talk about April 4th. And I emphasize this is proposed U.S. tariffs. These are new ones. This is a little bit different than what we've seen before. And I literally got the announcement from the White House to make sure I got the verbiage correct here. So the announcement that came out said that the U.S. will apply what they call reciprocal tariffs on products and countries who do these things. So that the U.S. reciprocal tariffs will apply if another country is doing this to us. if either they have imposed tariffs on U.S. products, if they use any type of unfair, discriminatory, or extraterritorial taxes on U.S. businesses, workers, consumers that included the value add tax. So this doesn't have to be a tariff for the U.S. to put reciprocal tariffs on. If it's a value added tax, which is very common for countries, in particular in Europe, it's called a VAT, or value added tax. If that applies to U.S. products, there's going to be this reciprocal tariff applied. If it costs U.S. businesses, workers, or consumers arising from non-tariff barriers or burdensome regulatory requirements. Now, this is, in my opinion, going to be kind of a challenge, is to determine exactly what is a non-tariff barrier or what's considered a burdensome regulatory requirement. But the announcement said that if we see that, if the U.S. Officials see that occurring, that there's going to be some kind of reciprocal tariff placed on that country and those products. Now, practices that cause exchange rates to deviate from the market value to the detriment of U.S. businesses, workers, and consumers. So this isn't necessarily even just products. It can be exchange rate manipulation or currency manipulation. Or any other practice, this is interesting, any other practice that imposes unfair limitations on market access or structural impediments to fair competition with the U.S. So if you combine all of those statements, this is a very, very broad, far-reaching statement. Now, whether this will actually happen, whether it will be, what the response is going to be, whether it's actually legal under U.S. laws, is still open for question and debate. So there's still a tremendous amount of unknowns with this announcement, but it is definitely putting the not only U.S. Consumers, U.S. producers, U.S. stock market, U.S. financial markets, as well as globally, a lot of concern about what this means, exactly how this is going to be implemented and applied. Now, I got my final slide here because I'm going to trace back a little bit to terminology, and I want to talk specifically about potential implications here. So there's a retaliatory tariff, and these are my definitions, by the way. I tried to look up some formal textbook definitions, but I couldn't find any that I really liked. So my terminology: retaliatory tariffs are tariffs that are in response to some other country's tariffs or trade policies. Okay, so if some country like China were to put tariffs on U.S. products, we will retaliate, meaning that if you do that, we're going to do something similar. But the specific rates, that percentages for the tariff and or the products, can be different. And that's what we're seeing right now, is these retaliatory tariffs. So the U.S. puts a tariff on, and other countries try and target those products that will try cause the most economic pain to U.S. consumers. So they're being a bit more like strategic or more directed at not only the rate, the percentages, but also the products. Now that's different from reciprocal tariffs. Usually when we talk about reciprocal tariffs, the intent is to match the tariffs or policies from another country. So those rates and products tend to be paired. So for example, if the U.S. put a 25% import tariff on steel and aluminum, then all of a sudden another country would say, well, we're going to reciprocate and we're going to put a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum that we buy from the U.S. So they're typically matched up. And that's what makes this reciprocal tariffs discussion a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more interesting than the retaliatory ones. So if the U.S. sees some what they consider unfair tariff or trade policies, the U.S. now is going to match what those other countries are doing. Okay, so it will be very interesting, in my opinion, to watch how that plays out. Because when we think about trade and trade policy, we tend to buy products from other countries that we don't produce enough of, and then we sell products from the U.S. to those other countries that they don't have enough of. So it's kind of unusual that you actually see where you have two countries that are trading back and forth, and they're sharing the same product. The one example that's often used in the news as an example for this reciprocal tariff is automobiles. So the U.S. produces automobiles here that we ship them into Europe to be sold. The tariff for U.S. automobiles going into Europe is higher than the tariff for European automobiles to come back into the United States. So that's the one that shows up in the press a lot. So we're trading cars back and forth, okay? And that makes some sense for this reciprocal. But for example, we might we don't have currently any tariffs under USMCA between the United States and Mexico on corn. Okay, so we can sell corn into Mexico and they can sell corn into the US. Now, we ship a lot of US corn into Mexico, but we buy almost nothing corn-wise from Mexico. So this reciprocal tariff thing is going to be a little bit more interesting to watch. Much, in my opinion, much more difficult to try and kind of plan out or give comment on what the implications might be. So with that, I'll be quiet. I'll be looking forward to your questions. I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand things over to Tim Petrie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Tim Petrie, Extension Livestock Marketing Economist. I'm certainly glad that Frayne just got through talking about reciprocal agreements versus retaliatory, because that's a big thing in the livestock and meat industry right now. And so far, unlike the crop side, the futures market in particularly, and for sure the cash market, has not really been bothered by tariffs. And so we'll talk about some of those reasons and see what's going on in a minute. So first of all, from the meat standpoint, our major U.S. meat export customers are shown there. And, just to move along quickly, circled in green, you see for beef, China, Mexico, and Canada are third, fourth, and fifth. And Mexico is our top pork customer, Canada down in fourth, and China fifth. And then again on chicken, Mexico, Canada, China. So you see kind of a trend there. Those are countries that are mentioned that might be included in retaliatory tariffs. And so what the meat industry is hopeful now is that we will go to reciprocal, because then we will be at where we are now and it'll be no problem. In other words, meat and livestock can go freely across Mexico and Canada like it is now. And so that would not be disruptive. As of now, however, like Frayne mentioned, China has increased their tariffs. There always was a tariffs. The problem is when we talk about beef and pork, and I think it's even the same case in crops and so on, there are 3 pages of different meat products. And so just boneless beef versus beef livers versus tails versus all kinds of other things. There are different rates that they have put on now, and now those are increasing. And the same with pork. A lot of byproducts go into China, and so they've increased. For pork heads and stomachs and livers and hearts and all those. Each one of those has a different rate, but they generally been increased. And kind of the same thing on the chicken side. They buy lots and lots. You see on the bottom, lots and lots of what they call chicken paws or chicken legs. We send a lot over there. And so they have not put as big an increase on tariffs on chicken legs because they want them as they have in some other products, you see. But those markets, for instance, on the bottom left, we send a lot of tongues to Japan and also to China. And those are things that we typically do not eat in the U.S., as well as chicken feet we don't eat in the U.S. So it's nice to have a market to send to, because it adds a lot more value, and we would just dump them in the tank here and grind them up for meat and bone meal. So far, yes, we are now sending less beef and pork and chicken to China, but we were kind of expecting less for now, because they weigh front loaded, particularly on beef and somewhat pork and others. They front loaded back in November and December, bought a lot in anticipation of this. China did. And so we were expecting to back off a little bit, and we have backed off of them, but it really has not impacted the market a lot now, but we'll have to wait and see. And again, remember the difference between reciprocal and so on, because it makes a difference. So, those are important markets for us. Again, right now we're waiting for April 2nd, and so we're free trading back and forth with, like we said, Mexico and Canada. They are important. On the left-hand side, you see how much every fed steer and heifer sold in 2024 got from the export market. So about $79 of every fed steer went to China, $50 to Mexico, and 35, 36 to Canada. And so, if this continues, and with the, I think we on some major beef products, we went from 12, or they went from a 12% tariff, increased it to 30, and then to 10%, as Frank talked about on those dates in February and March. And so we're up to 52%, and even for a lot of pork products, up to 85%. So on the right-hand side then is pork. To China down there in red, about approximately $9 of every pig sold last year was because of China. And then, Mexico was our big customer for pork, about $20 of every hog, and so on. So we're hopeful if, we stay at reciprocal, and maybe we would even go back to reciprocal with China. But we don't know that. Are we going to leave the other ones on or not? Those are all questions, like Frank said, and it's all up in the air. And then we have, to make a blanket statement about beef and pork is not very easy, because there's about 40 different products under each that now have different tariffs in China, and so that's kind of an unknown there. So move along again. Feeder cattle are important to North Dakota, so a little bit on that. I've talked about this before, but we do get down into the southern plains quite a few feeder cattle from Mexico, and they want them because in the fall you see a big spike usually occurs, and that's to put on winter wheat pastures down in the southern plains. And they like those southern cattle versus northern cattle because they're more adapted to the climate down there and so on. I just talked to my counterparts in Oklahoma, Texas today. It's going to be 80 degrees down there, and so but the U.S. and Mexico agreed to stop. They agreed to stop exporting feeder cattle and us importing feeder cattle back in November, when screwworm was found way down in southern Mexico. And so that shut the border, not because of tariffs, that was because of the disease problem. And so on the red line there, again, all red lines are always the most recent, through February till right at the end of February. Again, the border was closed. They did open up the border, and so feeder cattle are trickling in here now, and kind of back to that in a minute. But on the bottom side then, we, out of the northern plains here, particularly North Dakota and Montana, we do send quite a few feeder cattle up to Canada in the fall, around 40,000 head per month. And we did that this last year, and that would be kind of average. And it falls off here in January and so on. We're always a couple months behind in data, but we were even above last year, kind of closer to the average on feeder cattle going in January. And in there in yellow, I have a market report from Montana saying, highlighted there, Canadian buyers were back in the market this week and showed very good demand for calves to ship into Canada. So they then are willing to pay more than any U.S. buyer for those 30,000 a head a month or whatever they buy. So if we go to that, we don't know if there's going to be retaliatory tariffs, but if we go to reciprocal, this won't cause a problem because we have free trade with Canada and Mexico anyway, so it won't cause any disruption if we go to reciprocal, and that may be what we're hoping. So then let's go see. Here's calf prices in North Dakota, and again, they just been since late in September have just been going up, and we're at record high levels, just off a tiny bit last week, but right up there at 360 is all-time record highs. and again supported by lower supplies. Again, our cow herd, as I explained last time, has went down for 6 straight years, and so we have lower supplies, and still very strong domestic demand for beef, and even holding in their demand from Japan and those other countries that we ship beef to. Just China slacking off a little bit, and kind of we expected that. So calf prices are all at record high levels. Go to the heavyweight yearlings, the same exact story there. We're at near record high. We were just a little bit higher back there in early in mid about early to mid February, a little bit higher, but we're at record high levels. And there's the futures market across there. Yesterday's close in the feeder cattle futures, the last I looked, I'll show you April in a minute, is about unchanged from what it was yesterday. So there, but again, the futures market saying expectation of a little bit higher feeder cattle prices this year, but USDA is predicting higher fed cattle prices, and we'll have lower supplies. That all fits in. And the other thing is, you see that our cash price there is currently at record high levels, but kind of higher than the March futures, and but we have a positive basis up here on cattle, right now running $7-8. It depends on whether you're up at the 800 level or down at the 700 pound level or whatever. So that would show good prices again. And this is obviously, the market is assuming we will go to reciprocal, and so there won't be much. And then the unknown is China, whether we'll do reciprocal with them and go back to the old, or whether the tariffs will remain, and how that might affect the market. So again, you can see here's the April feeder cattle futures in black, and the green is the CME cash settlement price. That's all the right through, from North Dakota down through Texas, all the auction markets all added up every day, and get up with one cash price. And so actually, you see that cash price is typically for, ever since September, the futures market has been chasing the cash market up, because the cash market has been going up and up and up because of good demand and shorter supply and so on. And so yesterday, in the last day or so, the futures have been going up and got a little bit above the cash market, but that cash settlement price is a day behind. So that would be the cash settlement price back on Tuesday, and then this is showing you Wednesday's futures, and the cash settlement price is going to keep going up because it's a 7-day moving average, and the cash price has been going up. So they're right at the same where they should be, but you see the market really hasn't been phased at all, hardly, you could see, by trade issues. Another thing I didn't talk much about North Dakota last time when I talked about the cattle inventory report and so on, other than to say that we have 10,000 more beef cows in North Dakota as what it was expected. On the beef replacement heifer side, we have the same number of replacement heifers, 158,000, that we had last year. However, that can change during the year, and USDA isn't wrong. It's just because producers can change, and what those 158,000 heifers are really two heifer crops. One, it's the heifers that were bred last summer that are going to have, might start calving now or whatever. But on January 1st, when the survey was taken, they were bred heifers over 500 pounds, but they hadn't calved yet. The other part of that 158,000 is the calves that producers said were going to be replacement heifers that they were going to keep. These are the calves that they would breed this summer. And so you have really two sets there. But for those calves that they might breed this summer, that is a fluid, dynamic situation. And so if you go down at the bottom there, you see we had, on January 1st, we had 195,000 heifers over 500 pounds in North Dakota that weren't indicated. They were indicated by producers that they weren't replacement heifers. But the problem with that may be, or not a problem, but what happens is when a producer fills out the survey, they say, okay, I've got 100 cow herd, so maybe I've got 15 replacement heifers that were bred that are going to calf. Then I've maybe got 20 calves that I held back for replacements, and hopefully by next year 15 will get bred or whatever. And then I've got the other. And so those other heifers, when they go to an auction market, they can be purchased by somebody, and that goes on all the time. And every year, we always end up with more bred heifers than we have in the lighter weight saved, simply because they are purchased, and even more so when we have excellent weather conditions. It's very dry now, and so that may or may not occur. We're hoping for rain again. So here then is last week's USDA summary from, again, this is an average from Napoleon, Amanda, and Dickinson. And you see that are a lot of replacement heifer categories shown there by the market reporter, and they're bringing premium prices, $2,000 to $2,300 or whatever a piece. So these are heifers then that would be out of that other category, meaning that, if we get a lot of rain this spring, and this is the same for every state. So in the northern plains, it's down in the southern plains, their weather is a lot better. It's rain down there, and they're going to get more rain again. So would that happen down there on a U.S. basis or in North Dakota? Then we could end up with more heifers bred this summer than it was anticipated in that report, but it would have to rain a lot for us to do that. And then a little bit, since it's getting close to Easter and the spring holiday season, lamb prices usually do go up. And so I just show you that they are behaving quite seasonally like they usually do, and spark up for the spring holidays, be that the Passover or Easter or Ramadan. It's kind of, is already in, and they kind of change every day. So lamb prices, I think, behaving much like they did last year and could be expected. So with that, stop sharing and turn it over to Dave.
Yeah, so Dave Ripplinger, bioenergy, bioproducts, economic specialist. Much along the same lines as in the previous remarks, talk about trade and some uncertainty in the market, of course, in this case related to this space. One of the big pieces of news that did come out last week was the state of South Dakota has banned the use of eminent domain for carbon pipelines. It's essentially directly targeting the Summit Pipeline project, which has its main line going through the state of South Dakota with legs into Nebraska and Minnesota, and obviously coming into North Dakota. But a very big piece of news, Summit has not secured all landowners' permission to build the pipeline, and so this is a significant barrier. Then just a follow-up story from this week that Summit is asking the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission to postpone their decision, to postpone the process for Summit so that they can get a response in order. The Public Utilities Commission really wants to see, they've required that Summit provide the specific route for the pipeline. And obviously this eminent domain decision makes that much more difficult. Next, looking at some of the big changes and uncertainty that's been introduced into national markets, and again, looking at biofuels and carbon, we have a couple of things going on, and really for the most part, there's a lot of uncertainty. The Inflation Reduction Act has been mentioned repeatedly, but a decision to make a specific change, especially to 45Z, hasn't been announced. So that's really what much of ag is looking at, again, because there's a lot of growth opportunities or development opportunities within that, an additional line of revenue for both refineries and eventually to farmers. One of the big strong signals we got, almost immediately, and something we talked about last month, was the administration before essentially saying the SEC climate disclosure rules are done. And that was already being pulled back, a little bit under Trump, even more so under Biden. And now, that's done for now, which is a significant thing. And of course, we had just talked about funding with Inflation Reduction Act as it related to climate smart practices through NRCS, and then the climate smart public-private partnership is a CCC funded program that came about at the same time. Some pieces of good news is that a lot of the foundational sources of support for biofuels are still in place. And in fact, if we can look back to about a decade ago, the then Obama administration wasn't extremely aggressive in using the renewable fuel standard to encourage use of biofuels domestically. We saw almost immediately the state of California with their low carbon fuel standard, which now everybody in agriculture know kind of fill that role. And we're expecting similar things to happen. One of the most important things, the biggest biofuel in terms of volume and market size is ethanol. And again, two things just to keep in mind: almost all gasoline sold in the United States has ethanol blended with it to provide octane, and that almost all ethanol goes into that market. And so that is very much market driven, even though we have the RFS on top of it. That is driven by the relative price of corn ethanol versus other octane sources, aromatics, petroleum-based solutions. Looking at policies, we have a couple of things going on, and of course, we have California's low carbon fuel standard. That has supported the development of renewable diesel here in the United States, which has had direct impacts on the economics of soybean crush, and coming back all the way through via soybean oil to the price of soybeans and impacts on farmers. And we still see a lot of folks working aggressively and again independently of Washington in this space. And so one of the big changes in November was California's decision to increase the targeted reduction in the carbon intensity of fuels used in the state from 20% to 30%, which is somewhat demonstrated by the graph. Again, that's a very, very big aggressive move by the state of California, which fills much of that gap. And again, we do have low carbon fuel standards in Oregon and Washington state, smaller markets. We have Canada, which is a bit of an issue now with the trade relationship. But a lot of these things are still in place. So on top of the renewable fuel standard, on top of 45Z or things that could happen in Washington, market demand for ethanol, California's low carbon fuel standard for renewable diesel really provide a lot of support for these products. Looking a little bit at the EU, and going back to the SEC decision, in some regards, at least in a few years, it's not going to matter because these large public corporations that would have been regulated by the SEC are going to be regulated by the EU because they do business there. And that's just going to lead these folks they're going to have to respond and report as required. And those reports are going to have to be factual, the truth. And the SEC is going to end up being a de facto regulator because of that. Looking at SAF, a lot of interest in sustainable aviation fuel, especially in the last couple of years. One of the big underwriting messages going on in agriculture right now is the importance of biofuels to, especially soybean and corn, but it extends beyond that. The SAF was viewed as this growth opportunity, both in the near term and especially in the long term. That's the biggest source of support recently for SAF at the federal level was 45Z, which would have had a disproportionately large tax credit for SAF relative to other biofuels. We don't know for sure what's going to be done with that. I'm not particularly optimistic that it will be rolled out in force in time for it to have an impact as was originally designed. That being said, the European Union still has their refuel policy on the books. That was already at the forefront anyways. Basically, any plane that is flying into out of Europe has to use a minimum amount of SAF. They're probably not going to make very much SAF in the EU. This also applies to global carriers, departing from the US into Europe. And again, you can blend or use an average for this, so it's not as if every single flight has to have that amount, although we're going to get there pretty soon. But again, a lot of this SAF is going to be produced here in the United States, small volumes now, but increasing rather significantly. And of course, this is coming from government policy. We see similar things from industry, and so if you've heard the term CORSIA, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is essentially all the global airlines, they're all moving this way, regardless of what the federal government is doing. And that's going to, have this impact. It's not going to be as powerful and immediate of a system of developments coming, in the near term, but the actual physical is probably about the same, for the immediate situation, and then long term, we're going to need to decarbonize, or folks are going to require decarbonization of aviation, just like we have that for ground transportation for passenger and freight vehicle transportation. Moving over to ethanol exports, covering this very briefly, exports are critically important to the biofuel industry in a variety of ways for the feedstocks, especially corn, soybeans, canola, for the biofuels themselves, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and then also for the co-products, with soybean meal, dried distillers grains, all being an important part of the economics of the biorefinery. And that extends to the support and oftentimes the price that's received by farmers. And so these disruptions in trade, have a significant impact on biofuels, and then directly back to other parts of agriculture. We have a very strong trading partner in Canada. It's long been the number one destination for ethanol exports. Mexico is coming on board, but we're going to see exactly what disruptions are going to happen. And also, and this is in numbers wise is rather big. The EU and the UK combined are about 23% of our exports. This is coming from 2024, which is by far record exports for the United States ethanol industry, which is very significant. We have excess capacity in the corn ethanol industry, allowing these additional gallons to be produced, or having the demand for these gallons to be produced, has supported, obviously, the operation of ethanol refineries, supported the profitability of ethanol refineries. So this disruption is rather significant. Also, in the last week, we've heard from Canada, they're looking at filing a dumping claim against the United States as it pertains to renewable diesel. This is driven by the idea that 45Z, which is a production tax credit, is going to, it supports that activity, reduces the cost of production of the break-even cost of renewable diesel production in the United States. And then if there's not demand, if that gets pushed, if that is exported into Canada, it can be considered dumping. We'll see exactly how that goes. Last thing I want to talk about is a specific case, and it's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's a big enough issue within the ethanol industry, but it was actually used as a specific example by the Trump administration last month of an example of unfair trade practices, which is debatable, but certainly a reason to have reciprocal tariffs in place. And so right now we have tariffs on U.S. exports into Brazil at 18%, while we have imports from Brazil into the United States at 2.5%. So those don't align. And so the idea with reciprocal trade is, well, we should make that at least 18%. Again, the debate around that is kind of outside of our purview, but it is really interesting, and it's a very good example of it. Enough that the Trump administration used, and I think it resonates. There are a couple of things that a lot of folks don't know. Most of the ethanol production in Brazil today is not at the locations in Northeast Brazil where we have traditionally seen all of these imports. So you have these two geographic regions. We all know Brazil does not have great transportation infrastructure. So many times, especially during certain parts of the year, it was much less expensive for that northeastern part of Brazil to import ethanol from the United States via the Gulf than even get it, within country. The tariff has come on more recently. And then what's really important about this too is you have to realize that the sugar industry and the ethanol industry in Brazil are the same thing. The sugar cane mill, the sugar mill, has an ethanol refinery attached to it, and very much an integrated single factory in that case. but there's this relationship, so this absolutely core shared interest in the relationship between ethanol and sugar. And of course, here in the United States, we have a very strong level of protection for our domestic sugar industry. Uh, Essentially, above a certain level of tariff rate quota, above that quota, the import tariff is about $300 a metric ton. So that's far in excess of a 50% tariff on sugar leaving Brazil and the United States. And again, from Brazil's standpoint, it's the same issue. It's like, do you want it in this crystal form, this raw sugar form, or do you want it in this liquid fuel form? It's this, it's the same original feedstock, and so some of those same economics, which is, an interesting argument. And then finally, there was another point made, and actually, but when that was the reciprocal announcement was made, and this claim about unfair trade practices, biofuel industry was very supportive of that, and the administration. And finally, the industry is voiced their concerns about limitations on trade, the development of SAF, again, because with the EU, the United Kingdom, the International Civil Aviation Organization, they're all, reluctant, don't allow the use of food crops or, oil or other feedstocks from those crops to be used. Again, with this kind of food versus fuel situation, been a lot of pushback by industry on that, again, because it's seen as this growth opportunity. So those were the presentations for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in a second. Definitely open to questions and discussion. I think it's a pretty interesting time. So we'll leave that open. And I don't know if anybody wants to grab that first question.
Yeah, Frane's been trying to answer, doing a good job, I should say, of answering that.
Yeah, it looks like there's a couple of questions that come in. The first one, what problems are we trying to solve with the tariffs, and isn't there a more clearly thought out approach? Okay, so I'm gonna indirectly answer that question because there's not a lot of clarity. So just at a very high level, there's a few. So Congress has the authority typically to be able to write and approve trade agreements and or tariffs. But there are a few exceptions where there are special situations where the president and his administration can do this unilaterally. And there's a long list of them. A couple of them that you may have heard in the press. There's a Section 232, which is a national security interests. Section 232, that's really what President Trump is using as the basis for the steel and aluminum tariffs. That's what he did during his first administration. He's now doing it again this time. The idea, the concept is that steel and aluminum are critical to our military infrastructure because we use it in all of our tanks and airplanes and ships, etc. Another one you may have heard is called Section 203, which is the economic emergency. And essentially the 203 portion is what President Trump is using as the fentanyl and immigration issues. So he's using the fentanyl crisis and the immigration issues as the rationale for putting pressure on particularly Mexico and Canada to be able to make some changes in their policy structure. There's another one that you might have heard about. It's called Section 201. And I think that's where these reciprocal tariffs are going to come from. It's a legal thing that we need to be concerned about. But if there's a sudden surge of imports that somehow damage or threaten a particular industry in the United States, the president has an authority to come in and make unilateral decisions or negotiate trade agreements. So those are the things you're hearing in the press. It's under those different sections, those different rationales or reasons why the president has the authority to be able to come in and make these changes. Now, there's a lot of people theorizing right now that there's some other underlying objectives that President Trump and his administration have for these trade issues. I can't speak to those. He never called and asked me about them. I don't have a chance to call and ask him about them. A little bit of sarcasm, sorry about that. We don't have a lot of clarity. There are pieces that are showing up in the news. There's obviously some things that are coming out of the White House listing specific issues and items and criteria. There's a lot of things changing very, very quickly. So I think what you're trying to do is separate, is there a difference between what's being said publicly and is there some other underlying reason or issue? I don't know. I'm not sure that anybody can really comment directly on that. Another question, as economists, what are the short and long-term effects of tariffs? When looking at what is going on today, does the science of tariffs show positive or negative effects? And my standard answer is it depends. And I guess it depends upon the scale, the scope of the tariffs, specifically what kind of products we're dealing with. And I'm just speak for myself, then I'll be quiet and let others speak. One of the things I am concerned about as far as long-term issues or problems is that if we do get into some kind of trade dispute and there are tariffs that are being used and all of a sudden supply chains start to shift back and forth, the normal flow of products suddenly shifted to an alternative flow because of the tariffs. The longer that those tariffs are in place and that the longer this alternative supply chain becomes normalized or becomes more efficient, the harder and harder it is to be able to switch back to the original or the precursor to that supply agreement. So there is the potential that if these supply chains start to shift, that they will become more standardized, and it may be more difficult for the U.S. if and when the tariffs were to disappear, for us to work back into some of those markets we maybe I guess priced out of today. So that is one of the longer term concerns that I have is, especially for longer term, is when the tariffs come on, if they come on and they're dropped right away, that's one set of issues. But if they come on and stay on for an extended period of time and then go away, I think the kind of the carryover effects or the longer lasting effects will be more dramatic. Just my personal observations. I don't know if others have comments.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Frayne, in the meat industry. Right, one specific example, Mexico is by far our biggest market for hams. We ship a lot of hams down there. And so if we would have retaliatory tariffs and so they couldn't move down there free, I assure you that Brazil is just licking their chops right now over this tariff situation because they are increasing production of beef, pork, and chicken. They're our biggest competitor in the export market. We're the largest exporter of beef on a value basis and on a high quality basis, but Brazil does a little more on total volume. And pork, they're a competitor, and chicken the same way. So right now, I know there's a Mexican delegate, there's a Brazilian delegation in Mexico right now saying, hey, we've got hams, we want your ham market. So in the short run, if and I'm not saying that there's going to be reciprocal tariffs with Mexico and Canada, or retaliatory, I should say. If it's reciprocal, it really won't bother us because it moves freely now. If there's retaliatory, and that would last a long time, and Brazil would get our market, then likely we're not getting it back, and then we either have to eat ham here or find another market. That's just one example, and there could be many more. So I agree with you. Short term, it wouldn't be a big thing. Long term, structural change could impact us.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just throw out too. I mean, many of you have, and some of you haven't had the luxury of taking an international trade economics course or an ag policy course. We could break out the supply and demand charts and show the winners and the losers. It's important to think about, producers, domestic and foreign, consumers, domestic and foreign, the revenue generated, what's the intent. And every single market, every single dispute has unique characteristics for the most part. And so you can think, gosh, and that's why I want to talk about Brazil, not just because of biofuels, but in general, you can sit there and say, these tariffs are not equal. That's not fair. Arguably, maybe not. But there's more story behind it. And in this case, a lot of story behind it. And sometimes you miss important details where there's a large number of people in Brazil who would love to have no tariff on U.S. ethanol. And so you have to be very careful to kind of think about the nuance of each of these markets and what the tariffs might mean. In some cases, and I'm not going to ask him to do this, but Frank could talk at length and say, for this particular tariff, U.S. farmers will likely be significantly better off, at least in the near term. But you can't make blanket statements about it.
No, no.
Yeah, basically, and Dave mentioned the trade part. I mean, tariffs, most countries put tariffs on either imports or exports. Some countries have tariffs on their exports. In other words, if a company that's domestic wants to sell it to a different country, a foreign market, they have to pay the tariff before it leaves the country. Who does that benefit? Because, you're talking about question two here. What are the science of it? What was the question? Negative or positive effects? Well, in that case, it has positive effects for domestic consumers. If I put a tariff on something I'm exporting, and let's say we're on U.S. pork, for instance, if the United States government puts a tariff on pork leaving the U.S., who does that benefit? The American pork consumer, because it makes it more expensive to sell it. Therefore, the supply is a bit higher. Other countries do this. Argentina has an export tariff on beef, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Tim. And who does that benefit? It benefits the Argentina beef consumer. All right. If a
They've
country,
just lifted that as of today.
okay, so they just lifted it, but they've historically had
Yeah,
one.
for forever. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the people that benefited were the people going to the supermarket to buy beef.
Yep.
Now, if you're a country and you put a tariff on imports, okay, who does that benefit the most? Well, that mostly is going to benefit domestic producers of that product, right? And that's because it raises the price of imports of that product to the point that the domestic consumers can either be competitive or raise prices to meet it, to be just at or below that. And so that's sort of, so if you say, does it have positive or negative impacts? It depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
It's who is the tariff going in to help, and then who does it hurt? So I can't say a tariff has all positive impacts. I can't say that it has all negative. It depends on what we call elasticity of the product. In other words, how close are there substitutes for it? And then is it a tariff on goods going out or goods going in? And there's a lot of reasons besides political necessarily that countries put tariffs on. It might be to protect a domestic industry, which we've done in the past. It might be to grow a domestic industry that right now isn't competitive on the world stage, but they want to make it that way. Then sometimes it can be to change a behavior of another nation, and it really doesn't have. I mean, you're using economics to but there's not a purely economically driven reason for the tariffs to be put on. So that's why it's such a nuanced question to say who do tariffs benefit and who do they harm. It really depends on the tariff, who it was applied to, the elasticity of the product. In other words, how many close substitutes are there? Can you source it from someplace else? Those kind of things.
So guys, I need to drop off here pretty quick.
Okay.
I'll try and address that last question. Have you heard any more on the payments for the farmers through the American Relief Act 2025? Yeah, the payments are coming. Secretary of Agriculture Rawlings is trying to work on getting those checks out as quickly as possible. I have not heard the final official numbers on a per acre basis, but it sounds like it will be approximately 85% of the numbers that were originally announced earlier in several months ago. So the checks will be arriving shortly, or they'll be issued shortly, I should say, but it won't be the full amounts that you saw earlier in some of the early press releases. I have not got confirmation on what the final official numbers are.
Thanks, Fred.
So with that, I got to drop off here, guys. I appreciate the time, and I'll let you guys visit.
Just when the hard questions were coming. Does anybody have any last remarks? Brian, do you want to talk about normative and positive economics? I thought that's a good addition.
Well, I'll just hit it real quick. We have a term, normative versus positive statements in economics, and the difference mainly is what is or what is likely to happen, and then what should happen. Okay, one is more of a subjective uh, uh, point of view on what should happen. The other one's more of a just, hey, these are the facts as we know them. If you do this, this is the result. Now, whether that result is necessarily good or bad can depend on point of views and things like that. And that's more, again, the subjective part. What is or what isn't is more like the just the um, just the facts, or just using theory to analyze the situation. Okay, so for instance, if you say one of a hot button economic issue that's often discussed is, for instance, minimum wages. Okay, and I'll use that as an example. And in economic theory, when we're all going to school and learning about it, when you increase the minimum wage, you tend to reduce the number of potential jobs in some of these industries that pay minimum wages, whether it's food service or hospitality, those kind of things. The number of those jobs goes down as the minimum wage goes up. The other hand is the people making minimum wage make more money. That's hence the purpose of increasing the minimum wage, is people in those industries tend to, at the minimum wage level, make more. So then the question becomes, should you increase the minimum wage? Well, then that's where the debate comes in, is if you're going to reduce jobs, that's a potential negative. But you also increase the wages of those minimum wage individuals. And so one of those is sort of a not really a just the facts on the ground. And then the other one's more of a moral or a social responsibility conversation. And that's really the difference. If you want to go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And again, from NDSU Extension, we're intending to be unbiased, and so really talking about what is and what we expect, just based on economic theory and the circumstances as we know them. Uh, and this is a very interesting time. A lot of different things going on with trade and tariffs, and other parts of the U.S. economy, North Dakota's economy. And just to be clear on, extension and the role we want to play, science-based, unbiased programming is part of what we do. Again, for the benefit of folks who participate in webinars like this and everything else. But I think it's an important point to be made, and Brian, you put it well. So I'm glad we took the time.
One of the big ones we would talk about then is like farm policy in our role. Like, for us as extension economists, we will discuss the financial pros and cons, maybe, of a new farm bill update, for instance, changes to ARC or PLC or those kind of things. But should they happen, is this overall good? In some ways, we can't answer that question. It might be good for some and not good for others. So for me to say, well, this is a great policy, if there's winners and there's losers in there, then we can't make that statement, because but what we can do is say, for instance, a hypothetical might be the US, like we just talked about, puts an export tariff on US grown corn. Okay. So we would come on and say, well, that's going to be a bad thing for the US corn farmer who exports corn, but it's going to be a good thing for domestic pork producers, beef producers, and the domestic ethanol industry, because it's likely to bring down corn prices. So what I just said about what's going to happen with corn prices, that's the objective economic analysis of international trade. Should we do that? Well, that's a completely different conversation. I mean, your beef and your pork industry are going to say yes. That sounds like a great idea. The National Corn Growers Associations and corn farmers, not so much. So that's kind of the difference, and that's what we kind of juggle as we're discussing these things.
But thanks, Brian. Any last comments by today's presenters? Um, If not, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Went a little bit over. We might end up going over again in April. There's a few more things coming up that we expect. Again, thanks, Brian, Tim, Frayne, and Abstentia. As I mentioned before, the webinar was going to be edited. It takes a couple of days to do that, and then it will be uploaded to YouTube in the webinar webpage. Beyond that, we'll be back on April 10th. probably talking more about tariffs and trade. But until then, stay well. Thanks.